Hi everyone, welcome to the VGC Casters Cup, which is a draft league with the Regulation H rule set between several of the Pokemon VGC casters. So for this draft league, there's a total of 16 players, and the draft order was randomized, and I am number 12 on that draft order, which, as you will see later, did have some effect on the Pokemon that I picked. So, without further ado, let's go over to the Pokemon that were part of, or that were in the roster, and the ones we were allowed to pick. So, these were the tier lists for the Draft League. We were allowed 1 S tier, 1 A tier, 2 B tiers, 2 C tiers, 1 D tier, and 1 E tier Pokemon on our team. That also, in addition, we allowed 4 extra Pokemon that we can pick from any of the tiers. However, we only get 130 points to pick from as part of our budget, which means that in our additional 4 Pokemon that we pick, if, say, I wanted an S tier, then I would have to have 60 points deducted from that 130 points I have, which gives me 70 points. And whilst, yes, another S tier Pokemon is also 60 points under the 70 points, I require to have at least 4 Pokemon. So if I pick one S tier, I'm not allowed to pick another one, and at most I can say pick an A tier, but then I have to make up for it with 2 E tier Pokemon. So that does have a bit of an effect in the Pokemon that I pick, because if I pick 2 very strong Pokemon in the S and A tiers, it also meant that I had to balance it out with some very unqualified E tier Pokemon. Or, as some of the other players picked, they went with a more balanced approach of having more B tier and C tier Pokemon, which I think in a draft league can be very, very useful. So let's now go back over to the Pokemon that I picked. So the first Pokemon I picked on my team was Pelipper. Now, Pelipper actually was not my first choice. If we go back to that tier list, when I first had a look at the Pokemon that were available, I really wanted either Annihilate, Archaludon, the Golden Go, and either of the Ursalunas. They were the only Pokemon that I really wanted, but unfortunately, because I was number 12 in the order of draft, those 5 Pokemon are very premium S tier Pokemon, and they just got picked instantly. So I didn't really have the Pokemon in the S tier that I wanted, and I wasn't really sure which I wanted to go with. But what I did know was that because Archaludon was taken, I did not want Archaludon to be activated in the rain. I think Archaludon is incredibly broken in Regulation H, and yeah, there was no way I was going to allow Archaludon Rain to happen in the format. So I picked Pelipper mostly as a bit of a counter to that Archaludon. There really wasn't anything else. I think Pelipper is it is S tier, but it's not really an offensive Pokemon. Its greatest asset is its ability in Drizzle, setting up the rain, because your other choice is Politoed, which also got picked, and I believe Wingull in E tier. But I think, Pelipper does have a good mix of support moves like Wide Guard and Tailwind, and has some decent offense, especially in rain. Those Weather Balls, Hydro Pumps, and Hurricanes can hit really hard, even though Pelipper itself doesn't have the greatest special attack. So, the next Pokemon I picked on my team was the Ninetales. Now, in this draft league, the order of picking was also I believe it's called a snake draft, which means that the people at the end of the draft order also have first pick when the draft comes back around, which meant that although Pelipper, wasn't my first choice and I only picked it because everything else in S tier that I liked was taken, but it meant that when it came back round to making my A tier picks, I had fairly early priority. And I think in Regulation H and also in Draft League, even though I've never done a Draft League before, from what I can see, bulk is going to be quite important because a lot of the Pokemon, a lot of the viable Pokemon are very much spread out between players, which means that the teams typically tend to be a little bit more low powered, and Aurora Bell is just very, very strong in a low power format. Not to mention, I think Ice and Fairy is a nice coverage. Ninetales itself isn't the most offensive Pokemon out there, but it's got great speed and just a fantastic support move pool. Not to mention, Ninetales is just one of my favourite Pokemon, so that was a fitting choice. Now the next Pokemon on my team was the Palafin. So Palafin was kind of interesting because I originally wasn't planning on picking it this early. What I had thought going into this draft was that everyone would make their S tiers, and then their A tiers, and then the B tiers, C's, and D's and E's. But then what I noticed is, after I made the pick of Ninetales, it meant that it would be another 24 Pokemon would be drafted before it was my turn again. And I noticed everyone else started immediately spending their budgets on their second S tier. And so at this point, a lot of the other viable Pokemon in S tier, like Garchomp and Dragonite, and basically a bunch of the dragons got taken, and I think by the time it came around to me, all the S tier Pokemon that were left were all the support Pokemon like Sableye and Grimmsnarl and Indeedee, which I didn't want because if you look back at my first two picks, neither the Pelipper or the Ninetales is particularly offensive, and I knew I needed a really offensive Pokemon on my team just to make up for the fact that at the moment I didn't have that much offensive presence, and Palafin really was, I think, the only Pokemon there left on the S tier that had a lot of offensive presence. I'm not the biggest fan of Palafin because of the requirement to switch out, but it's got it's a bit one-dimensional, but it does have Haze, which is very good because I know Ben Kiriakou had picked Dondozo, and when it came down to me, I had the choice of either picking Tatsugiri to stop the Dondozo, but then that meant I was stuck with a lone Tatsugiri, or I could just pick a really strong S tier Pokemon with Haze and just not worry about Dozo at all. Palafin also came with the bonus of being powered up by Pelipper in the rain, and I think, Terra Water, Mystic Water, Wave Crash from a Palafin in the rain can probably OHKO a large majority of this format. So I think Palafin was quite a nice pick overall. The next Pokemon on my team was the Scrafty. By now, I had my offensive powerhouse in Palafin, I had my two support Pokemon in Pelipper and Ninetales, and Incineroar, I can't remember if at this stage it had been taken, but I didn't really want to spend my S tier slot on Incineroar, and, well, actually I couldn't because I already had Pelipper and Palafin. So I knew I needed an Intimidate user, and Fake Out is also just really strong because in a closed team sheet format, sometimes you want to be able to buy your teammates that one turn, and Scrafty just had the perfect mix of offense and defense. The fighting type is quite nice against, I think at this point in the format, a lot of players have picked a bunch of Pokemon that were weak to fighting, and Scrafty it's not as common now in modern day Pokemon, but back in the day during, Gen 5, Gen 6, it was really strong, and it's got fantastic bulk, so that was the next Pokemon I picked. And now we go over to Gallade. So Gallade is an interesting one because I didn't really want to pick it. I always have a soft spot for the entire Routes family line, and Gallade was actually on my in-game team. And I know how hard Sharpness Gallade can hit. My issue is that Gallade has really bad defense. It's got fairly good special defense, but it's just so frail defensively. And if you look at all the other Pokemon that my fellow casters picked, they're all really strong physical attackers. And sometimes it's okay if you've got a frail Pokemon if it's fast, but Gallade isn't that fast. And I think I only picked Gallade because at this point the Pokemon in B tier, the one that I really wanted besides Scrafty, was actually the Corviknight. But Corviknight got picked by Sierra, and so I didn't really have any nice options, and I was also a little bit worried about things like the Archaludon, Dondozo, and a Sacred Sword from Gallade. I felt could kind of mitigate a lot of the setup in the format. So I went with Gallade, but I'm not too sure, and I think it's probably going to be one of the Pokemon that I swap out later on. Now the next Pokemon on my team is Cottony. Now this might seem like a very strange pick because Cottony actually is in E tier, and at this point everyone was picking a bunch of C tiers and B tier Pokemon, whereas I started to have some, well, basically I didn't start the draft with much thought put into it. I had a list of Pokemon that I wanted, and all of them had been picked up to that point except for the Ninetales. And I started thinking about, so I've now used up my S tier budget. I have 70 points left to pick, and I didn't really want anything in the C, D, or E tiers, but I did want some stuff in the A tiers. But if I picked an A tier Pokemon, it meant that I now had to have 3 E tiers, and this was the point where I started looking at the list of E tier Pokemon and thinking to myself, well, if I need 3 E tiers, and the E tier Pokemon, not very many of them are viable, so I thought I better get the jump on getting the E tier Pokemon that I actually wanted and that are actually useful, because since I don't care about the C tier or the D tier, I may as well just let everyone else take their picks. I'll pick up my E tier Pokemon and let them worry about, once I picked all the viable ones in the E tier, then I can go back. So I picked Cottony because it's got Prankster, which is a very valuable ability. Now, at first, I actually thought Cottony was just baby Whimsicott. I did not realize until after I picked Cottony that it did not get access to Tailwind or Light Screens. So that was my bad. I think if I had known, it may have affected me picking Cottony. Maybe not much, because Cottony still has some good support moves. But anyway, I picked Cottony because I wanted a Prankster Tailwind, and then I realized there was no Prankster Tailwind, so that was a bit of a whiffed pick. But the next Pokemon I had on my team was the Alolan Executor. Now, I'm quite happy with this pick. I don't think Executor was on my radar originally, but at this point, I didn't have any defensive cores. There's, the common Firewater Grass core, which I didn't have, then the common Fantasy core of Dragon, Steel, and Fairy, which I also didn't have. And I thought, I've got the offensive presence in Palafin and Gallade. Maybe it's time to think about getting a bit more defensive. So, thought to round out a Firewater Grass core with a Grass type, and I also needed a nice bulky Dragon type just to soak up hits. And Executor, with the combination of Harvest, can be really useful in ensuring its longevity on the field. and it's just such a funny Pokemon. So I really like Executor. I'm kind of curious to see how well it'll do. Say a combination of, Leech Seed with Harvest and behind, say, Aurora Veil can be really, really strong for Executor. Not to mention, it's also got Frisk as an ability, and there may be niche situations where maybe I don't want Harvest, and Frisk can be quite useful in a closed team sheet format. So that's Executor. The next Pokemon on my team was Cloyster. So at this point of the draft, a lot of my other casters had started moving on to all the E-tier Pokemon, and I was starting to get worried because I picked my Cottonee, which I was happy with, but I still had 2 more E-tier Pokemon to pick, and there really isn't that much viable Pokemon. I think from the list of E-tiers, there was the ones that I wanted at least would have been something like Meganium or Forretress and Cloyster. And there were a few other Pokemon like Pikachu and Grookey and Sentret, which I think have some good utilities, especially if there's a Focus Sash placed on them. So I thought I'd like Cloyster first because so many players have picked ×4 weak or ice ×4 weak to ice Pokemon like Dragonite and Garchomp, and I thought having Focus Sash Cloyster with Skill Link and Icicle Spear can do quite a lot of damage. Not to mention there were some spores running around, and Overcoat's also a pretty nice ability, but overall I think Cloyster it's got some decent attack and very good defense. It could potentially be a nice niche Pokemon in certain situations. So that was Cloyster. Next Pokemon on my team was the Quillfish. So at that point, now that I had my 2 E-tiers that I would say quite strongly wanted, I wasn't very sure what other E-tier Pokemon that I wanted. So I focused my attention to the remaining S-tier Pokemon, the remaining C-tier Pokemon that I could pick. And at this point, I think because I made my 2 E-tier picks while everyone else had already made their C-tier picks, there wasn't much left in the pool. And I thought Quillfish, with its addition of poison and dark typing, could be quite useful. Not to mention, it's got actually 2 very good abilities. So Intimidate is always going to be a fantastic ability, and then Swift Swim could potentially be quite nice on my rain team as well. So I think Quillfish has 2 good abilities, a fantastic typing, not the greatest offensive prowess, but it's got great defensive typing, and the fact that it can hold an Eviolite, I'm relying on this Quillfish to be quite a bit of a defensive pivot. Now I will say, at the time of picking Quillfish, I thought it got access to moves like Snarl and Knockoff, and this is my fault. I probably should have checked this before I picked it, but after I picked it, I realized Quillfish didn't learn any of these moves, and it's actually got a very limited move pool. So although I do like Quillfish's typing and its useful abilities and stats, if I were to swap out some Pokemon later on, Quillfish might just be one of them. The next Pokemon I picked, which was in my D tier, was Zebstrika. Zebstrika's kind of an interesting one because at this point, I had my Fairy type, I had my Dragon type, so I did want a Steel type to round out the core, and there was one Steel type in the D tier that I was interested in, which was the Magneton. And Magneton, I think it's got pretty decent special attack, decent defenses. With the Eviolite, it could have good longevity, but I was very worried about that ×4 weakness to ground. There's a lot of Pokemon that can learn ground moves, and in a closed team sheet format, I didn't really want to get sniped by some random ground move. And at this point, I also realized I have 3 water types on my team, all of which I'm not going to enjoy taking any electric attacks. And I thought, well, there's a lightning rod user in the D tier. Zebstriker's got very good speed as well. It's got some nice support moves, such as Electro Web. And I thought maybe Zebstriker, with its great ability, could be very good against, against opposing teams with electric moves, and also in protecting my team. Not to mention it can provide some good support. It's also got Sap Sipper, which I think against certain teams that don't have electric coverage and say maybe rely on things like Spore, because at this point several players had picked sleep users. I thought Sap Sipper could be a nice surprise just to switch in the Zebstriker and get an attack boost off of it. The next Pokemon on my team was the Sentret. This was the second last Pokemon that I picked. And out of all the Pokemon that were remaining in the E tier, I actually originally wanted Pikachu because it had Lightning Rod and Fake Out. But Lou got Pikachu, which, fair enough, that's her mascot. So I was left with, I think, from all the Pokemon that I wanted in the E tier, it was just Sentret and Grookey left. Now, I was thinking about picking Grookey because it's got Fake Out and it's got Grassy Terrain. Yes, Grassy Surge, sorry, not Grassy Terrain. It's got Grassy Surge, which could be very good against Psy-Spam, which Sierra had. What I realized later on was that I don't have any redirection, and I think redirection is incredibly helpful in a closed team sheet format. Not to mention, Sentret also gets access to Frisk, which is an incredible ability in closed team sheet. Sentret itself also, even though it has 0 offensive presence, it gets Endeavor and Super Fang, so those could potentially be extremely helpful in supporting the team. So yeah, I picked Sentret mostly for the Follow Me and that Frisk ability, and I guess we'll see whether or not the Sentret will do some work. And now, the very last Pokemon to be picked was this Galarian Weezing. So, since it was the final pick of every player, I left Weezing till last because a lot of players had already picked or spent all their budgets. So I knew that I was absolutely safe in the A tier. Nobody else could actually pick an A tier Pokemon at this point. So I left the final Pokemon for my A tier till last, and I had 2 choices. It was either between the let me just go back to the A tier list. It was either between the Magma or the Weezing. Now, Magma can be quite good. The combination of Vital Spirit and Follow Me and the bulk could be really, really nice. But I thought at this point I had Quillfish, which I did plan on bringing to a lot of games, and you can't have 2 Eviolites on a team. Magma itself, not exactly accurate. It's got good moves like Overheat and Heatwave. They're not 100% accurate, and it also means that I can't really use that if I bring Pelipper. So ultimately I figured Galarian Weezing could be actually quite nice, because a lot of my fellow casters have picked Pokemon with very, very broken abilities, and well, I could just shut down the absolutely broken abilities with the most broken ability of all, which is Neutralizing Gas. At least I think that's a very broken ability in Regulation H. The problem is, of course, I'm running a Weezing, which, not the greatest Pokemon. It is decently bulky though, and So I think Weezing could be an important Pokemon on my team, quite useful, and I can see myself bringing it to a lot of my upcoming games. So that's the team overall. You can see down at the bottom. And yeah, I'm predicting that I'm going to be using Palafin a lot. And I think as the weeks go on, I'll probably swap out either the Gallade or the Quillfish. But we'll see how the games play out. And we'll catch you for week 1 of the Draft League.